You might not be a romance reader, but surely these covers are familiar to you. Perhaps you remember seeing them on your mother's nightstand, in a flea market, or at the supermarket's book section. You may have come across them through Amazon and Kindle. These books are what people call trashy romances, body sweepers, racy historical novels, and erotica. Hello everyone, my name is Eva, and today we're going to dive into the history of the trashy romance. Romance novels have always been controversial and deemed a low form of fiction because they are usually written by women for a female audience. However, these novels can be more complex than people give them credit for. They have their own set of conventions and they differ from the average love story. The oldest form of romance have almost nothing to do with love stories. The term comes from the medieval French word romance, which was used to designate long narratives about high adventure stories written in the 12th century by Chrétien de Troyes. The stories were about the Arthurian myths and the knight's amorous exploits. Similar fictions were favored in Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese. As a result, the term romance developed in connection with the literary form taken up by those writing in Romance languages. Some Shakespeare plays, such as The Tempest and Cymbeline, are called romances, but the love stories in these plays play minimal roles because the plot of these stories centers on the high adventure aspect, not the courtship. Nowadays, the publishing industry no longer uses the term in this sense. It will be rather misleading if they did, because stories like Lord of the Rings will fall into this category. We could say that this term has been replaced by what we know today as the fantasy genre. Love stories are stories in which people fall in love, and from there, anything could happen, because love stories are usually realistic. The love story might be part of a novel's main plot or subplot. For instance, Colleen Hoover does not write romance, she writes fiction about relationships. Publishing houses sell some novels as romances as a marketing strategy. In contrast, romance, as we know the genre today, follows particular conventions. It features a love story as the main plot and conflict of the novel. It has a happy ending, and its main theme is love conquers all. Romances are very transformative. Their characters have flaws, but they are willing to change, or the power of love changes them. These stories do not aim to be realistic, but credible. For this reason, romance is considered an escapist form of fiction. The term trashy romance is used to designate poor-quality romance novels that contain explicit sexual scenes. They are also associated with mass production. Many are self-published novels, so they do not go through a traditional editing process. However, the term trashy is entirely misleading because many of these novels are actually well written. Elizabeth Reed Boyd states, "There are not many literary genres as loved and loved as romance fiction. For all its millions of female readers for hundreds of years, it has been dismissed as sentimental, sappy, and trashy, as well as mad, bad, and dangerous to read. Yet romance fiction, written by women, published by women, read by women, and researched by women, remains one of the most popular and powerful genres on the planet." So why are they considered trashy? Where does the stereotype come from? And the most crucial question is, how does one rip off a bodice? To answer these questions, we must go back to when education became accessible to women. When the first schools for girls were opened in England, only few had access to them. Some families could not afford it, some girls were not allowed to attend, and others had to rely on charity. The education was also gendered. While women were expected to learn French, Italian, or German, men were taught Greek and Latin. The reason for this was that the English society considered that mother languages were fashionable and therefore appropriate for women. Ancient languages, on the other hand, granted men access to higher education, while women were not allowed into the universities yet. With a few exceptions, the exclusion of women from the ancient studies lasted almost until the 20th century. Virginia Woolf states, "There was chastity, of course, and her handmaiden innocence, sweetness, unselfishness, sympathy, all of which might suffer if women were allowed to learn Latin and Greek." The sexual education of boys and girls was very precarious. As it still happens, boys and girls sought to learn the mechanics of sex through fiction. Boys got it easier because they had early access to education. They were sent to boarding schools, and away from their parents, they could share their findings with their friends. They might have been acquainted with Ovid's Ars Amatoria, Sappho, and Lucian of Samosata. When they came of age, some were lucky enough to be taken to a brothel to experience their first times there. Boys, and especially girls that belonged to the lower classes, tended to be more experienced than girls that belonged to the upper classes. Because for the upper classes, marriage was completely transactional, and that meant that the chastity of a woman had to be preserved. As a result, women from the upper classes tended to be more sheltered than girls from the lower classes. In other words, girls from the upper classes often had to rely on fiction to learn about sex. But English books with sexual content, such as John Cleland's Fanny Hill, were banned during the 18th century. Pirate editions of these novels began to circulate during the 19th century. So these books were unlikely to be found in the libraries of respectable families. Many of these novels had been previously banned, and the authors had to release sanitized editions in order to continue selling copies. Other works that contained light references to sex, such as Shakespeare's plays, were edited to produce a sanitized version of the stories that was family-friendly. In 1807, Henrietta Butler published a Shakespeare edition that excluded multiple scenes, swearing words, and lewd jokes. On the one hand, these works became more accessible to women. On the other hand, these editions reinforced the idea that women's sensibilities had to be protected. This left girls in obscurity when it came to sexual education. They had to rely on the euphemisms that their mothers and governesses employed to explain the sexual act. That was, of course, until they learned French. Respectable families could easily avoid buying bawdy English novels such as Daniel Defoe's Moll, Flanders. Nonetheless, French novels were easier to smuggle into a family's library. Some people might have been in the possession of the books for generations without them even noticing their presence. A man might have bought the books before the first woman in the family had learned French. Many French novels had yellow covers so that people could identify them as books with lewd content. They featured stories with forced marriages and non-consensual sex. However, the female protagonist usually empowered herself through her sexuality. Although the tropes are awful and these stories usually romanticize rape, to understand their popularity, we need to see them through a 19th century lens. In the upper classes, most marriages were arranged, and the few love matches that existed relied on long-distance courtships. Even if a woman was in love, she might have known very little about sex, and she might have ended up trapped in a horrible marriage because she barely knew her husband before moving together. Under these circumstances, these stories offer women the hope that one day they will enjoy having sex. The stories were also fun to read because they were very different from what was acceptable in society. Both men and women read them for pure entertainment. For instance, in Oscar Wilde's An Ideal Husband, Lady Shipley, who fears nothing and is very comfortable with her sexuality, confesses, "I have never read a blue book. I prefer books in yellow covers." Government reports came in blue covers, so Lady Shipley finds politics boring. She rather spends her time reading French novels. In Angela Carter's short story The Bloody Chamber, the protagonist enters her husband's library to find something to read. She expresses her disappointment at not finding a book to her liking. Nothing here to detain a 17-year-old girl waiting for her first embrace. I should have liked, best of all, a novel in yellow paper. I wanted to curl up on the rug before the blazing fire, lose myself in a cheap novel, munch sticky liquor chocolates. Michaela Marini Hicks explains, while historical romance remains a major part of the romantic fiction genre today, experts agree that Body Sweepers describe a short and a specific moment in American publishing history that lasted only between the early 1970s and mid-1980s. Replacing shorter and serialized novels with more sexually explicit books, inspired by the popularity of The Flame and the Flower, released in 1972, Body Sweepers met reader demand and flooded the market with mass-produced romances. This was where the cheesy book covers we associate with romance novels, and later Flavio, came from. Although I agree that Body Sweepers reached their highest popularity between the 1970s and 1980s, books with similar tropes have been written since early in the century, and authors continue to write Body Sweepers today. These novels usually take place in a historical setting. Regarding their conventions, Biakosh states, representing some of the problematic politics of the 1970s, rape is a major plot device in many Body Sweepers, meaning that in most cases the ripping and removal of clothing isn't consensual. With heroines eventually falling in love with the rapists, the books offer an uncomfortably sanitized glamorization of rape and romance that modern readers understandably find difficult to contend with. Two theories try to explain this phenomenon. Koch argues that this plot device was popular because of the era's repressive sexual attitudes, appealing to women who wanted sex but didn't feel like they were allowed to openly express those desires. Another theory suggests that these stories deeply address another cultural issue of the time, where rape was a real part of women's life and a constant threat, but victims of sexual assault were saddled with the stigma of being tainted or second-hand goods. By incorporating romance and having a woman marry the man who took her virginity, a heroine avoided having to find someone else who would want a ruined woman. The plot device largely disappeared during the 1980s, suggesting that forced seduction might not have been as titillating and popular among readers as publishers assumed. At any rate, history repeated itself. Circumstances similar to the ones that shaped the 18th century erotic novel brought about the Body Sweepers of the 1980s. With the Industrial Revolution, we began to have mass production of books. There are also more people writing and more people reading, so cheaply printed books are being produced for the lower classes. Most of these stories are sensation fiction, known as penny dreadfuls and yellowbacks. They were very cheap and they were sold at the railway stations. Due to the sensational content of these stories, the readers will go through them quickly. So these were not well-crafted stories because the authors had to write them in a rush. Although some of those writers are celebrated figures today, most of them are men. The women who wrote for penny dreadfuls and yellowbacks usually did it under a pen name or anonymously. Such is still the case today with trashy romance novels. The issue with the trashy romance novel is that it features more sex scenes or scenes that are more explicit than the average romance novel. What happens is that they end up being stigmatized by publishing houses, bookstores, and readers because they still consider the genre a lesser form of fiction. So most of the authors end up self-publishing anonymously or under a pen name. Considering the fact that many of these novels do not undergo the same editing process as conventionally published novels, the end product is pretty neat. Some might have few typos and their plots might not be perfect, but these issues do not make them less successful than traditionally published novels. In fact, many trashy romance authors get to make a living from their writing. The reason for this is that romance readers read a lot, which means that authors have to be continuously publishing. According to Hadlett, the modern romance lays its taproots in a scandalous new bucket of fiction called the sex novel that troubled the censorship codes of Anglo-America, an often censorious term coined by journalists that became fashionable after 1905. Sex novels' more explicit focus on the problems and pleasures associated with sex was not just unorthodox, but judged dangerous to women's health and racial purity, accordingly to many elites. This book's emphasis on sexual psychology and interior sensations, as much as stimulation and particular acts, differ from existing so-called pornographic literature aimed at men. It is important to notice that although some erotica novels fall under the trashy romance category, Most trashy romances are not erotica. They might contain sex scenes, but their plots usually don't revolve around sex. Romance novels are not porn with plot. There are many reasons why these works are stigmatized. People call them trash because of their contents and formats. Through an elitist perspective, these works might be seen as cheap because they are novels of rapid consumption for the masses. In other words, society thinks that these novels are for uneducated people. People don't call these novels trashy because they are bad or because they are romantic. Clean romance novels are never considered trashy. Sadly, society still sees female sexuality as something dirty that women must be ashamed of. So novels that explicitly explore female sexuality are deemed bad quality fiction. Some readers also consider these stories to be anti-feminist. Hilary A. Hadlett explains that, long critically reviled as trash, the popular romance have been blamed for a variety of women's readers' ills, including reconciling them to the patriarchy by promising women happy endings for their pains. Boyd agrees with her. Romance has represented a dilemma. Scholars, including Jeremy Greer, have considered it a form of deception that deliberately prevented women from recognizing their oppressed and subordinate roles in patriarchal society. Tanya Motlesky dubbed it mass-produced fantasy. And that's precisely what trashy romances are. Mass-produced fantasy. The problem with these arguments is that they are extremely condescending and underestimate women's intelligence and ability to discern fantasy from reality. More so, why does society think women's fiction ought to educate us? There's nothing more anti-feminist than a woman who tells another, "Listen, I know better than you because I'm more educated." Women read these novels for enjoyment and not to learn about women's rights. Not everything we read must be moralizing. Also, we should never rely on fiction or blame fiction for women's sexual education. If girls are still getting their sexual education from fiction, we should blame their parents and the system for being so lame and for teaching women to hate their bodies and be ashamed of their desires. Hilary A. Hadlett continues, "Most forget that the fundamental purpose of the modern romance when it first developed was to explore the force of women's desire and to expose the many barriers thrown up to prevent women's exercise of free love." Nowadays, many of these novels also present speculative elements in that they explore situations that would have been considered taboo in the Regency or the Victorian era. As Bridgerton shows, these novels can feature interracial marriages and homosexual couples. Sometimes they do it in a fantasy historical setting free from discrimination. And sometimes they stick to the historical context, in which case the stories explore the what if. What would have happened if two women fell in love but couldn't get married? In these cases, the novels turn into a deep exploration of the social realities that oppress marginalized people. I have mentioned before that just like fantasy fiction, romance novels are not supposed to be realistic, but credible. Can we learn something from them? Of course, just as we can learn something from The Lord of the Rings. However, the purpose of romance novels is by no means to instruct women on how to deal with matters of love. They aim to create a world in which men are willing to change for love, or where love can transform the protagonist. That's where the escapist element of romance lies. Reading The Fellowship of the Ring will not make me steal my uncle's ring and set on a journey to destroy it in Mount Tambora. So why will people think that reading romance novels would make me submit to the patriarchy? We also need to ask ourselves why stories that feature sexual assault for pure shock value are acceptable for publishing, but novels that depict consensual sex scenes are deemed unworthy. Next time you hear someone mocking trashy romances and body sweepers, remember that at least we, trashy romance readers, know that one should never wear a corset without a chemise. I leave you to that. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this video essay, and I'll see you next week. Bye!